They called it obsolete before the war even started. The M1917 Browning water-cooled machine gun weighed 93 pounds with its tripod, required a team of at least 3 men to move and operate, and demanded gallons of water to function. By 1941, when the Marine Corps was scrambling to equip itself for a war everyone knew was coming, the M1917 was already 24 years old. It belonged to the previous war, to the trenches of France, to a kind of fighting the modern military theorists insisted would never happen again. The Marines knew this. Their own tentative manual for landing operations, published in 1935, emphasized mobility and fire superiority in amphibious assault. Speed was paramount. Get ashore quickly, move inland rapidly, seize objectives before the enemy could concentrate his forces. The doctrine called for light, portable weapons that Marines could carry across beaches and through jungle without exhausting themselves before contact. The Army had already moved on. They were transitioning to the M1919 Browning, an air-cooled version that weighed 41 pounds with its tripod. Nearly half the weight. No water cans to carry, no cooling system to maintain, no hoses to spring leaks at the worst possible moment. The M1919 could be operated by 2 men instead of 3, freeing up riflemen for the assault. It was modern, efficient, and perfectly suited to the mobile warfare everyone expected to fight. But First Sergeant Mitchell Paige, standing on Guadalcanal in the darkness before dawn on October 26, 1942, was grateful beyond measure that his platoon had kept their ancient, obsolete, impossibly heavy M1917 water-cooled guns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese were coming. He could hear them assembling in the jungle below his position on a ridge the Marines had designated Hill 121. Voices carried in the tropical night, the sound of equipment being readied, the distinctive metallic clicks of rifle bolts, officers shouting orders in Japanese. They were not attempting stealth. They were preparing for what their doctrine called keshi, a decisive assault that would break through the American lines through sheer aggressive spirit and numerical superiority. Paige's machine gun section held a critical position on the ridge. Below them stretched the jungle approaches to Henderson Field, the airstrip that both sides understood was the key to Guadalcanal, and perhaps to the entire Solomon Islands campaign. If the Japanese broke through here, they would sweep down onto the airfield. American air operations would cease. Reinforcement and resupply would become impossible. The entire Guadalcanal operation, which had been hanging by the thinnest thread for 3 months, would collapse. The sergeant checked his guns one final time. 2 M1917 Brownings, positioned to cover the most likely avenues of approach. Each gun sat on its M1917 tripod, the heavy steel frame providing a stable firing platform. The water jackets around the barrels were full, checked personally by Paige an hour earlier. Ammunition belts lay ready in their cans, 250 rounds per belt, fabric links holding the .30 caliber cartridges in perfect alignment. His gun crews were in position, though he could see the exhaustion in their faces even in the darkness. They had been on the line for weeks, fighting malaria and dysentery along with the Japanese. What Paige understood, what his experience had taught him, even if the military theorists in Washington had forgotten, was that there were moments in combat when mobility meant nothing and firepower meant everything. When the enemy came at you not in small groups, you could engage and maneuver against, but in waves, in human floods that threatened to overwhelm your position through sheer mass. When your job was not to advance but to hold, not to pursue but to survive, not to outflank but to kill so many of them so quickly that the attack broke apart before it reached your foxholes. For that kind of fighting, you wanted the M1917. You wanted its water-cooled barrel that could fire continuously for hours without overheating. You wanted its weight, which kept it steady during sustained fire. You wanted its reputation for absolute mechanical reliability, even when covered in mud and coral dust. You wanted the weapon that every Marine knew could keep shooting long after everything else had jammed or melted or broken. The noise from the jungle grew louder. Then, at 0200 hours, the Japanese artillery opened fire. The M1917 Browning was born from the nightmare of the Western Front. In 1917, when America entered the Great War, the Army discovered it had virtually no modern machine guns. While British, French, and German forces had been developing and refining automatic weapons for 3 years of industrial slaughter, American infantry were still equipped primarily with bolt-action rifles. The situation was so desperate that American units initially went into combat armed with French Hotchkiss and Chauchat machine guns, weapons that were adequate at best and notorious at worst. John Moses Browning changed that. The legendary firearms designer had been working on a machine gun design since 1910, refining a recoil-operated mechanism that would prove to be one of the most reliable automatic weapon systems ever created. When the Army finally tested his design in 1917, observers watched it fire 20,000 rounds continuously without a single malfunction. The weapon passed every test the Army could devise. It was adopted immediately as the M1917. The key to its reliability was the water cooling system. The barrel sat inside a steel jacket filled with water, typically about 4 quarts depending on the variant. As the gun fired, heat from the barrel transferred to the water, which absorbed it and prevented the metal from reaching temperatures that would cause warping or failure. A rubber hose connected to the water jacket led to a condensing can, where steam could escape and condense back into liquid, returning to the system. In theory, if you kept adding water to replace what evaporated, the gun could fire indefinitely. The M1917 arrived in France just in time to prove itself in the final offensives of 1918. American machine gun companies used them to devastating effect in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where the ability to lay down sustained suppressive fire allowed infantry to advance across terrain that would have been impassable under German defensive fire. One sergeant famously fired 30,000 rounds through a single gun over a 6-hour period without stoppage. The weapon worked exactly as designed. After the war, the M1917 became the standard heavy machine gun of the American military. It equipped infantry companies, was mounted on tanks and aircraft, and formed the backbone of defensive positions. But by the 1930s, military thinking had evolved. The next war, strategists believed, would be a war of movement. Mechanized forces would race across open terrain. Infantry would ride in trucks and half-tracks. Static positions like those of the Western Front were relics of an older, more primitive kind of warfare. The M1919 emerged as the solution. Browning had designed it during the Great War as an aircraft weapon, but after 1918 it was adapted for ground use. The air-cooled barrel eliminated the water jacket, saving weight and complexity. You could carry it faster, set it up faster, and move it to a new position faster. For mobile operations, it was clearly superior. But there was a cost. The air-cooled barrel could not sustain fire the way the water-cooled gun could. After approximately 200 continuous rounds, the barrel began to overheat. Recommended procedure was to fire in bursts, allowing air to cool the barrel between engagements. If you needed sustained fire, you changed barrels, swapping the hot barrel for a cool spare. This required an asbestos glove, several seconds of exposure while making the change, and spare barrels carried with the gun crew. The M1919 was rated for 400 to 600 rounds per minute in practice. The M1917 could maintain fire at that rate for hours. The difference seemed academic in training. In combat, it would prove to be everything. The Marine Corps, always operating with less funding than the Army and forced to make older equipment last longer, kept substantial numbers of M1917 guns in service even as they acquired M1919s. This was not entirely by choice. In 1941, the Corps had approximately 2,000 machine guns of all types for roughly 60,000 Marines. There simply were not enough M1919s to equip everyone. Some units, particularly those designated for defensive operations or garrison duty, retained the older weapons. When the 1st Marine Division deployed to Guadalcanal in August 1942, Its machine gun companies carried both types. The M1919s went to the assault battalions, where mobility was critical. The M1917s were distributed to units that would hold defensive positions, particularly around Henderson Field. This was logical resource allocation given limited supplies. It was also, though no one quite realized it yet, a decision that would save lives, and possibly the entire campaign. The Japanese had their own doctrine, and it was rooted in principles fundamentally different from American tactical thinking. Where American forces emphasized firepower and coordination, Japanese military philosophy elevated fighting spirit to the level of doctrine. This was not merely propaganda or motivational rhetoric. It was formalized military theory, taught at the Imperial Army Academy and embedded in field manuals. The concept of seishin, spiritual strength, held that properly motivated soldiers with superior morale could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese infantry training emphasized aggression, offensive action, and the decisive value of cold steel. The bayonet was not merely a weapon but a symbol of warrior spirit. Soldiers trained extensively in bayonet combat, learning techniques that dated back to samurai sword fighting adapted for modern rifles. This philosophy produced the tactic that would define Japanese infantry combat throughout the Pacific War, the Banzai charge. The term came from the battle cry Tenno Heika Banzai, meaning roughly long, live the emperor, though the literal translation was closer to 10,000 years. In practice, a Banzai charge was a mass infantry assault conducted at close range, often at night, with the objective of overwhelming enemy positions through speed, shock, and numerical superiority. The tactic had worked in China. Japanese forces had been fighting there since 1937, and Chinese armies often broke when faced with aggressive night attacks. Chinese defensive positions, frequently poorly constructed and weakly held, could be overrun by determined assault troops willing to accept casualties. Japanese officers drew the lesson that offensive spirit could defeat superior numbers and defensive preparation. It had worked against the Soviets at Nomonhan in 1939, at least initially. Japanese infantry attacks had penetrated Soviet positions in several engagements before Soviet artillery and armor counterattacked. Even in defeat, the Japanese casualties included many soldiers who had died in close combat after breaking through the initial defensive line. The tactic itself had not failed, the broader strategic situation had. In the early campaigns of the Pacific War, it continued to work. British, Dutch, and American forces in the Philippines and Malaya, many of them poorly trained or unprepared for jungle warfare, had indeed broken under aggressive Japanese attacks. At the Battle of Slim River in Malaya in January 1942, Japanese forces using night infiltration and aggressive assault tactics shattered British positions. In the Philippines, American and Filipino defenders were driven back repeatedly by attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once in the darkness. The Banzai charge, from the Japanese perspective in mid-1942, was validated doctrine. It combined tactical aggression with psychological warfare. American soldiers, they believed, lacked the spiritual preparation for this kind of combat. They would panic when attacked at night. They would break when faced with soldiers willing to die to close with them. Their superior equipment and firepower would mean nothing in the chaos of close-quarters combat, where rifles and grenades and bayonets decided the outcome. This belief was reinforced by Japanese intelligence assessments of American forces. Reports described Americans as soft, accustomed to material comfort, unwilling to accept hardship or casualties. They were good at defensive fighting where they could rely on firepower, the reports suggested, but poor at offensive operations requiring initiative and aggression. They could be beaten by superior morale and fighting spirit. There was a logical structure to this thinking, flawed though it was. If your enemy relied on firepower, and you could close with him before that firepower became decisive, you negated his advantage. If you attacked at night when visibility was poor and defensive fire was less effective, you maximized your chances. If you concentrated overwhelming force at a single point, rather than attacking along a broad front, you could achieve breakthrough even against a well-armed opponent. And if you accepted casualties that the enemy would find unacceptable, you could win through sheer determination. The problem was that this doctrine assumed the enemy would fight the way Chinese forces had fought, or the way unprepared colonial garrison troops had fought in 1941 and early 1942. It assumed that aggressive close assault would reach the enemy positions before defensive fire could stop it. It assumed, fundamentally, that machine guns had limitations that infantry courage could overcome. On Guadalcanal, those assumptions would be tested against Marines who had no intention of breaking, against defensive positions that had been carefully prepared, and against weapons that could sustain fire far longer than Japanese planners had calculated in their doctrine. The M1917 Browning, despised as obsolete, was about to demonstrate why sustained fire capability mattered more than mobility when the enemy insisted on attacking your fixed position in concentrated waves. Why water cooling was not an archaic complexity, but a critical feature. Why the extra weight and the three-man crew and the gallons of water and all the other inefficiencies that made the weapon unsuitable for mobile warfare made it perfect for the kind of combat the Japanese doctrine was about to force upon the Marines. Mitchell Paige, standing on that ridge with his ancient Great War machine guns, understood none of this in doctrinal terms. He understood it in simpler, more direct language. When they come, he had told his gun crews, you keep shooting until they stop coming or until you run out of bullets. The guns will hold. Make sure you do too. The M1917 that Mitchell Paige's crew operated was serial number 43721, manufactured by Remington Arms, in 1918. It had been rebuilt at least twice in its service life, with replacement parts installed at the Philadelphia Arsenal in 1934 and again at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in 1941. The weapon showed its age. The bluing on the barrel jacket was worn to bare metal in places where countless hands had gripped it. The wooden handles on the spade grips were darkened with the oil and sweat of 2 decades of training exercises. But the internal mechanisms were sound. The bolt locked up with absolute precision. The feed system drew cartridges from the belt with mechanical regularity. The recoil spring, replaced during the Mare Island rebuild, provided exactly the resistance needed to cycle the action. And the water jacket, that heavy steel sleeve that everyone complained about carrying, held 4 quarts and 2 ounces of water that had been drawn from a creek half a mile behind the ridge and hauled up in jerry cans that afternoon. Each gun had a primary gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer. The primary gunner, Corporal Johnson, controlled the trigger and aimed the weapon using the leaf sight mounted on the receiver. The assistant gunner, Private Totman, fed the ammunition belts into the gun and monitored the water level in the jacket through a small sight glass on the side. The ammunition bearer, Private Gaston, kept the belts coming from the ammunition cans and watched for targets the gunner might miss. They had 12 cans of ammunition per gun, each can holding a 250-round belt. That was 6,000 rounds total, 3,000 per gun. The ammunition was M19 ball, the standard 30 caliber rifle cartridge used in the Springfield rifle and the M1 Garand. Each round consisted of a 150-grain full metal jacket bullet loaded to produce a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second. At the cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute that the M1917 typically achieved, each gun could theoretically fire all its ammunition in under 7 minutes. But sustained fire was not about emptying magazines as quickly as possible. It was about maintaining continuous fire for as long as necessary. Marine doctrine called for firing in bursts of 6 to 9 rounds, allowing brief pauses for the gunner to adjust aim and for the barrel to cool slightly. This extended the effective firing time and improved accuracy. The water jacket made longer bursts possible without the barrel overheating that plagued air-cooled weapons. The position Paige had selected offered excellent fields of fire. The guns were positioned approximately 40 yards apart, far enough that a single mortar or artillery round could not disable both, close enough that their fire zones overlapped. Each gun covered roughly 120 degrees of arc, with the overlap creating a beaten zone where nothing could survive. The tripods were dug into, shallow pits, sandbags piled around them to protect the crew from small arms fire and shell fragments. Behind each gun position, the Marines had stacked the ammunition cans within easy reach. They had filled several additional water cans and placed them nearby, though no one really expected to need them. In training, they had never fired enough to require refilling the water jacket. The pre-war machine gun course at Quantico taught barrel discipline and ammunition conservation. You fired in controlled bursts, you maintained your equipment, and you never wasted ammunition on targets you could not clearly identify. Guadalcanal had already taught them that pre-war training sometimes bore little resemblance to combat reality. In the 3 months since the landing, Marines had learned to fire at shadows and sounds. They had learned that Japanese infiltration tactics meant you might have enemies behind you as well as in front. They had learned that night combat in the jungle was a matter of sound and muzzle flash and desperation rather than clearly identified targets at known ranges. What they had not yet experienced was a full-scale assault by concentrated Japanese infantry. Small probes, yes. Company strength attacks, certainly. But not the kind of mass assault that Japanese doctrine called for when attacking a critical objective. Not the human wave that doctrine suggested could overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers and aggressive spirit. The Japanese 17th Army had assembled approximately 20,000 troops on Guadalcanal by late October. Their objective was to recapture Henderson Field, which required breaking through the Marine defensive perimeter. The plan called for multiple simultaneous attacks to spread the defenders thin, with the main effort directed at what intelligence suggested was a weak point in the southern perimeter. That weak point was the ridge where Paige's machine guns were positioned. The Japanese had assembled the 16th and 29th Infantry regiments for the assault, approximately 5,000 men. They had artillery support, though limited by the difficulty of moving heavy guns through jungle terrain. They had surprise, attacking in darkness when American firepower would be less effective, and they had absolute confidence in their tactical doctrine. Aggressive night assault by determined infantry would break through. It had worked before, it would work again. At 0200 hours, the artillery preparation began. Japanese mountain guns, 75mm pieces that could be disassembled and carried through jungle trails, opened fire on the Marine positions. The shells were not particularly accurate, and there were not many of them, but they served their purpose. They announced the attack was coming. They forced the Marines to take cover, and they provided noise cover for the infantry forming up in the darkness below the ridge. Paige and his gun crews stayed low during the barrage, which lasted approximately 15 minutes. Shells burst in the jungle canopy above them and in the clearing in front of their position. Shrapnel whined overhead. One round landed close enough to throw coral fragments into their foxhole, stinging exposed skin but causing no serious injury. Then the artillery stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. Paige could hear his own breathing, the creak of equipment as his men shifted positions, the distant sound of artillery fire from other sectors of the perimeter. Then he heard the Japanese. They were shouting as they advanced, hundreds of voices yelling in unison, officers calling commands, soldiers responding with battle cries. The distinctive sound of many men moving through jungle vegetation, branches snapping, equipment rattling. Paige estimated they had perhaps 60 seconds before the assault wave reached effective small arms range. He checked his gun one final time. The water jacket was full. The ammunition belt was properly seated in the feed tray. The bolt was forward, the weapon ready to fire. Beside him, Totman gripped a fresh ammunition belt, ready to feed it when the first ran dry. Behind them, Gaston had opened 2 more ammunition cans and extracted the belts, laying them out for quick access. The assistant gunner for the second gun, 30 yards to Paige's right, gave a thumbs-up signal barely visible in the darkness. Both guns were ready. The rifle squads between and behind the gun positions were in their foxholes, weapons aimed at the jungle edge. There was nothing more to prepare. Now they waited for targets. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They came out of the jungle at 02:17 hours, and there were far more of them than Paige had imagined possible. Not a company, not even a battalion, but what seemed like an entire regiment emerging from the darkness in a solid mass of humanity. The first wave was perhaps 200 yards away when they became visible in the faint starlight, a dark tide of moving figures spreading across the clearing that separated the jungle from the marine positions. Paige opened fire. The M1917 roared to life, the distinctive sound that veterans described as a slow chainsaw, deeper and more deliberate than the faster-firing German MG-42s they would encounter later in other theatres. 450 rounds per minute translated to 7.5 rounds per second, a steady hammering rhythm that was fast enough to be devastating, but slow enough that an experienced gunner could maintain control. The tracer rounds, loaded every fifth cartridge in the belt, arced out into the darkness in flat red lines. Paige walked his fire across the advancing wave, seeing figures stumble and fall. The second gun opened up moments later, its fire converging with Paige's to create a crossfire that swept the entire clearing. The Japanese kept coming. This was what their doctrine demanded: close with the enemy before his firepower becomes decisive. Accept casualties during the approach, because once you reach his position with bayonets and grenades, his advantages disappear. The soldiers in the first wave understood they might die before reaching the marine lines. The soldiers in the second and third waves, following close behind, would use their bodies as cover to get closer. Eventually, someone would reach the foxholes, and then fighting spirit would decide the outcome. But the doctrine had not accounted for sustained fire. Paige's gun did not fire a burst and then pause to cool. It fired continuously, the water jacket absorbing the heat that would have melted an air-cooled barrel in minutes. Totman fed belt after belt into the weapon, the empty brass casings cascading out the right side of the receiver in a continuous stream. When the first ammunition can was empty after 250 rounds, perhaps 30 seconds of firing, Gaston already had the next belt ready. Totman connected it to the last few links of the previous belt, and the gun never stopped. The beaten zone in front of the position became a killing ground. The converging fire from both machine guns created an area roughly 50 yards wide where nothing could survive. Japanese soldiers advanced into it and were cut down, fell, and were hit again as they lay on the ground because the fire was so continuous that even prone figures were struck by the low trajectory rounds. The bodies began to pile up, creating obstacles that forced following waves to slow down or move laterally into areas where rifle fire from the marine infantry could engage them. Still, they came. The Japanese officers, following their own doctrine, pushed more men forward. If the first wave failed to break through, the second wave would. If the second failed, the third would. Eventually, the Americans would run out of ammunition, or their weapons would fail, or their nerve would break. The assault must continue until breakthrough was achieved. Paige's gun fired through the first 1,000 rounds without stoppage. The water in the jacket was heating up. He could feel it through the steel when he briefly touched it, but the temperature was well below boiling. The system was working exactly as designed. The barrel inside the jacket was hot enough to glow red if exposed to air, but the water absorbed that heat and prevented metal failure. As long as the water lasted, the gun would keep firing. The second gun, operated by Sergeant Pettyjohn, was performing identically. Its steady hammering joined with Paige's weapon to create a wall of fire that no infantry assault could penetrate. When Pettyjohn's gunner was hit by a rifle round, the sergeant himself took over the weapon without missing more than a few seconds of fire. When his assistant gunner was killed by a grenade that landed in their position, a rifleman from a nearby foxhole crawled over and took his place feeding belts. At 02:45 hours, 28 minutes after the assault began, Paige's gun had fired approximately 2,000 rounds. The water in the jacket was hot enough that steam was beginning to escape from the condensing can, but the level in the sight glass showed the jacket was still more than half full. The gun's mechanical operation remained flawless. The bolt cycled with perfect regularity, extracting spent cases and chambering fresh rounds without hesitation. The feed system drew cartridges from the belt smoothly, despite the heat and the vibration and the coral dust that covered everything. The Japanese assault began to falter. Not from loss of morale, their soldiers continued to show the aggressive spirit their doctrine demanded, but from simple arithmetic. They could not reach the Marine positions faster than the machine guns could kill them. The sustained fire was cutting down soldiers at a rate that exceeded the rate at which they could advance across open ground. The tactical problem became unsolvable. Movement forward meant death. Staying in place meant being pinned down and destroyed by rifle fire and grenades. Retreat was not permitted by doctrine or by officers who would shoot men who fell back. Some Japanese soldiers, recognizing the impossibility of frontal assault, tried to work around the flanks of the machine gun positions. A group of approximately 30 men moved through a ravine to Paige's left, trying to approach from the side where the beaten zone did not cover. Marine riflemen engaged them at close range in vicious fighting that came down to grenades and bayonets. The Marines held, but barely. Another group penetrated between the two machine gun positions, getting into the shallow depth of the defensive line before being stopped by reserve riflemen. Paige could hear the fighting behind him, the crack of M1 rifles, and the sharper reports of Japanese Arisaka rifles mixed with the crump of grenades. But he could not leave his gun. The assault in front of his position had not stopped. Japanese soldiers were still trying to advance, and if he left the gun unmanned, they would break through. At 0330 hours, 73 minutes after the initial assault began, Paige's gun had fired approximately 3,200 rounds, the entire basic load for his position. Gaston was breaking open the reserve ammunition cans, the ones that were supposed to last for days of defensive fighting. The water in the jacket was boiling now, steam pouring from the condensing can, but the level was still adequate. The gun continued to fire. By 0400 hours, the character of the fighting had changed completely. The Japanese assault waves had stopped coming. Bodies lay in piles in the clearing, stacked 2 and 3 deep in some places where successive waves had fallen on top of earlier casualties. Paige estimated at least 400 dead, Japanese in front of his position alone, perhaps more that he could not see in the darkness. The sustained fire had created casualties at a rate that no doctrine could overcome. Individual Japanese soldiers, cut off from their units and unable to retreat, continued to fight from whatever cover they could find. Some were in shell craters, some behind the bodies of their own dead, some in small depressions in the coral ground. They fired at muzzle flashes, threw grenades toward Marine positions, and called out to each other in Japanese. But the organized assault had collapsed. Paige's gun had fired approximately 4,000 rounds, more than double the amount that doctrine suggested would be necessary for any defensive action. An M1919 air-cooled gun would have burned through at least 2 barrels by this point, possibly 3, requiring barrel changes under fire in the darkness, while Japanese soldiers were 100 yards away. The M1917 had used the same barrel for the entire engagement, the water jacket absorbing heat that would have destroyed an air-cooled weapon. The water level was low now, the sight glass showing perhaps a quarter capacity remaining. Paige sent Gaston back to the reserve position to bring up fresh water. While he was gone, Paige and Totman continued to fire short bursts at targets of opportunity, individual soldiers visible when they moved or fired their rifles. The gun's rate of fire had slowed, not from mechanical problems but because there were fewer targets and ammunition conservation was becoming a concern. When Gaston returned with 2 jerry cans of water, they carefully poured water into the jacket through the filling port on top. The metal was hot enough that the water sizzled when it made contact with the interior surface, flashing to steam immediately before condensing against cooler water below. They added approximately 2 gallons, bringing the level back up to 3/4 capacity. The gun was ready to sustain fire for hours more if necessary. At 0430 hours, with false dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the Japanese made one final attempt. Perhaps 200 soldiers, survivors from the broken assault waves and reserve troops who had not yet been committed, launched a desperate attack against Paige's position. They came fast, running across the clearing in small groups rather than formed waves, trying to use speed and dispersion to reach the Marine lines before defensive fire could stop them all. Both machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The convergent fire created a beaten zone that caught most of the attackers in the open. Marines in the rifle positions engaged targets that made it through the machine gun fire. The assault reached within 30 yards of Paige's position before breaking apart completely. A handful of Japanese soldiers made it close enough to throw grenades. One exploded near the second machine gun, wounding the assistant gunner, but none reached the foxholes. By 0500 hours, full daylight revealed the extent of the carnage. The clearing was covered with Japanese dead. The exact count would be determined later after the battlefield was secured, but preliminary estimates suggested over 700 Japanese casualties in front of this single sector of the perimeter. Most had been killed by machine gun fire, evident from the multiple wounds many bodies displayed. The sustained fire had not simply stopped the assault, it had destroyed it so completely that unit cohesion had collapsed. Paige's M1917 was covered in coral dust and carbon fouling, the water jacket streaked with rust stains where condensation had run down the sides. The barrel inside had fired approximately 5,000 rounds over nearly 3 hours. When they finally removed the barrel days later for inspection, they found the rifling was still intact, the chamber still properly dimensioned. The weapon had suffered no permanent damage from the engagement. The Marine Corps after-action report, filed on November 3, 1942, noted that machine gun fire had been decisive in stopping the Japanese assault. It specifically mentioned the effectiveness of sustained fire in breaking up massed infantry attacks. It recommended that water-cooled weapons be retained for defensive positions, despite their weight disadvantages, because their sustained fire capability was unmatched by air-cooled alternatives. Japanese survivors, questioned after their capture or surrender later in the campaign, expressed shock at the volume and duration of American defensive fire. They had been taught that aggressive assault would close with the enemy before his firepower became decisive. They had trained for breakthrough tactics that accepted casualties during the approach phase. But they had never encountered defensive fire that did not pause, did not slacken, and did not stop until the assault wave was destroyed. One Japanese officer, a company commander who survived the assault wounded, told his interrogators that he had led 3 companies into the attack, approximately 450 men. Fewer than 50 reached friendly lines afterward. The rest were killed or missing, most of them cut down by machine gun fire before they got within grenade range of the American positions. His doctrine had told him that aggressive infantry could overcome defensive firepower through superior spirit and shock action. The reality had been that no amount of courage could cross ground swept by continuous machine gun fire. The weapons that military theorists in Washington had dismissed as obsolete, the heavy water-cooled guns that mobile warfare doctrine suggested were relics of trench warfare, had proven to be exactly what was needed when the enemy's doctrine forced him to attack prepared positions with massed infantry. The M1917's disadvantages, the weight and complexity and 3-man crew, meant nothing when you were defending ground you had no intention of leaving. Its advantages, the sustained fire and mechanical reliability and immunity to barrel overheating, meant everything when the enemy kept coming in waves, and your job was to kill them all before they reached your foxhole. Mitchell Paige received the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. The citation mentioned his leadership and courage under fire, his refusal to abandon his position even when wounded, his personal operation of the machine gun after his crew was killed or wounded. But Paige himself, in later years, always credited the weapon. The M1917, he said, was the gun that saved Henderson Field. Everything else, the courage and the training and the determination, would have meant nothing if the gun had failed. The sun rose on October 27, 1942, over a battlefield that looked like an abattoir. The clearing in front of Paige's position was carpeted with bodies, many stacked 2 and 3 deep where successive waves had fallen. marine burial details, wearing masks improvised from torn t-shirts soaked in water, spent 3 days clearing the dead. The final count for the entire perimeter came to over 1,500 Japanese killed. In the sector Paige's machine guns had defended, they counted 712 bodies. The machine guns themselves required surprisingly little maintenance. The M1917 that Paige had operated was stripped down, cleaned of coral dust and carbon fouling, and inspected by the battalion armourer. The barrel showed wear but remained serviceable. The water jacket had developed a small leak near the bottom where a bullet fragment had struck it, but the damage was easily repaired with a welded patch. The gun was returned to service within 48 hours and would continue to serve through the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign and beyond. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The airstrip that both sides understood was the key to the entire Solomon Islands campaign stayed operational, allowing American aircraft to continue striking Japanese shipping and supporting marine operations across the island. The Japanese never mounted another assault of comparable strength against the southern perimeter. Their losses in the October offensive had been too severe, their remaining forces too depleted to attempt another breakthrough. But the tactical lesson travelled faster than the strategic outcome. Within weeks, machine gun sections throughout the Marine Corps were receiving updated guidance on defensive fire planning. The emphasis shifted from mobility to sustained fire capability for units in defensive positions. Water-cooled weapons, which had been gradually phased out in favour of air-cooled models, were retained in greater numbers. New doctrine emphasised overlapping fields of fire, ammunition stockpiling, and preparation of multiple water sources near machine gun positions. The Army, initially skeptical of Marine claims about the effectiveness of water-cooled weapons, began its own analysis after receiving the after-action reports. The Ordnance Department conducted firing tests comparing the M1917 and M1919 under sustained fire conditions. The results confirmed what Guadalcanal had demonstrated. The air-cooled gun could fire approximately 200 rounds before requiring a barrel change. The water-cooled gun could fire continuously for hours, limited only by ammunition supply and water availability. By mid-1943, Army infantry divisions preparing for Pacific operations were issued additional M1917 guns specifically for defensive positions. The Ordnance Department increased production orders, bringing back into manufacturing a weapon they had planned to phase out entirely. By the end of the war, over 53,000 M1917 machine guns had been produced, many of them manufactured during the war years when doctrine had supposedly rendered them obsolete. The weapon saw service on every Pacific island where American forces fought defensively. On Tarawa in November 1943, Marine machine gunners used M1917s to stop Japanese counterattacks against the beachhead, firing an estimated 40,000 rounds in 3 days of fighting. On Saipan in June 1944, water-cooled guns positioned on the perimeter fired continuously for over 6 hours during a massive Japanese Banzai charge that cost the attackers over 4,000 dead. On Peleliu in September 1944, on Iwo Jima in February 1945, on Okinawa in April through June 1945, the pattern repeated. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to sustained machine gun fire. Their doctrine remained committed to aggressive infantry assault, modified only in details like timing and approach routes. They continued to believe that proper spirit and determination could overcome defensive firepower, even as casualty reports from every major battle demonstrated otherwise. Some Japanese commanders, recognizing the futility of frontal assault against prepared positions, shifted to defensive tactics in later campaigns. But when ordered to attack, Japanese infantry still came in waves, and American machine guns still cut them down. The psychological impact on Japanese survivors was profound and consistent. Interrogation reports from across the Pacific theater showed the same pattern. Japanese soldiers expressed shock at American firepower, particularly the sustained nature of defensive fire. They had expected machine guns to fire in bursts with pauses between. creating gaps that aggressive assault could exploit. The reality that American guns could fire continuously for minutes or even hours contradicted everything their training had taught them. One captured Japanese lieutenant, interviewed on Saipan in July 1944, described his experience attacking an American position defended by machine guns. His company of 130 men had advanced in 3 waves. The machine gun fire had not stopped between waves. It had continued, unbroken, cutting down the first wave, then the second, then the third. He had survived by remaining in a shell crater, while his entire company was destroyed around him. When asked what he had learned, he said simply that Japanese doctrine was based on fighting Chinese armies with limited automatic weapons. Against Americans with unlimited ammunition and weapons that never stopped firing, the doctrine was suicide. The industrial disparity that the M1917 represented extended far beyond machine gun production. The water cooling system required manufacturing capacity for precision-machined steel jackets, rubber hoses, and condensing cans. It required a logistics system that could deliver spare parts, replacement barrels, and ammunition in enormous quantities to islands thousands of miles from the continental United States. It required training facilities that could teach proper maintenance and operation of complex mechanical systems. And it required an industrial base that could sustain all of this while simultaneously producing ships, aircraft, tanks, artillery, and every other material requirement of global war. The United States possessed this capacity. By 1943, American factories were producing machine guns at a rate that exceeded total Japanese production of all infantry weapons combined. The Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company alone produced over 350,000 M1917 and M1919 machine guns between 1940 and 1945. Frigidaire, better known for refrigerators, manufactured over 40,000 machine guns after converting its production lines. The Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors produced over 28,000. This was production on a scale that Japanese planners had not imagined possible when they initiated the Pacific War. Japan's entire machine gun production from 1941 through 1945 totaled approximately 90,000 weapons of all types, including the Type 92 heavy machine gun, the Type 96 light machine gun, and various other models. American production of just the Browning machine guns, not counting other weapon types, exceeded 400,000 units. The ammunition disparity was even more stark. Each M1917 in combat required approximately 5,000 rounds per month in sustained defensive operations based on Guadalcanal experience. For 50,000 guns, that was 250 million rounds per month. American ammunition plants, operating 24 hours per day with 3 shifts, produced over 47 billion rounds of 30 caliber ammunition during the war. That was enough to supply every machine gun in the Pacific Theater with tens of thousands of rounds, while simultaneously supplying rifles, carbines, and other weapons that used the same cartridge. Japan produced approximately 1.5 billion rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition during the entire war. American monthly production exceeded Japanese annual production by a factor of 3. By 1944, Japanese ammunition shortages were so severe that infantry units were limited to 30 rounds per rifleman for some operations, forcing them to rely on bayonet charges not by choice but by necessity. The Marines on Guadalcanal, firing 5,000 rounds through machine guns in a single night, were drawing from ammunition supplies that seemed inexhaustible because, from a practical standpoint, they were. The logistics system behind them could deliver more ammunition in a week than Japanese forces on the island had available for an entire month. The industrial system behind that could replace any weapon lost or damaged faster than combat could destroy them. This industrial capacity translated directly into tactical capability. American doctrine could emphasize sustained fire precisely because sustained fire was possible. Machine gunners could be trained to fire until the enemy stopped coming because there would always be more ammunition. Water-cooled weapons could be employed because the logistics system could deliver the water, the spare parts, and everything else they required. The tactical flexibility American forces enjoyed was built on industrial capacity that made every tactical option viable. Japanese forces enjoyed no such flexibility. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive assault, partly from military tradition and cultural factors, certainly, but also from practical necessity. When your ammunition supply is limited, you cannot engage in extended firefights. When your industrial capacity cannot replace losses, you cannot trade material for time. When your logistic system struggles to deliver basic supplies, you cannot afford complex weapons that require elaborate support. Japanese infantry doctrine was aggressive because passivity would have meant slow defeat through attrition that Japan's industrial base could not sustain. The Banzai charge, viewed from this perspective, was not simply cultural preference or tactical doctrine. It was strategic necessity disguised as tactical choice. Japan had to seek decisive battlefield outcomes because it could not win wars of attrition against industrially superior opponents. The emphasis on fighting spirit was partly motivational rhetoric, but it was also recognition that Japanese forces could not match American material advantages and therefore had to seek victory through factors other than firepower. This explains why Japanese doctrine changed so little despite repeated tactical failures. It was not stubbornness or inability to learn from experience. It was recognition that the alternatives were equally unviable. Defensive warfare would lead to defeat through artillery and aerial bombardment. Withdrawal would cede territory that could not be recaptured. The only option was continued attack, accepting horrific casualties in hope of breakthrough that would force advantageous political settlement, if not outright military victory. American forces, facing these desperate attacks, had the luxury of defensive firepower because their industrial base made such firepower possible. The M1917 machine gun was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of industrial capacity, of logistical capability, of an economic system that could sustain global warfare while simultaneously raising living standards at home. The Japanese soldiers who died in front of those guns were not defeated by superior courage or better training. They were defeated by factories in Detroit and ammunition plants in Indiana and a railroad system that could move raw materials from mines to factories to ports with mechanical efficiency. Mitchell Paige survived Guadalcanal and continued to serve through the rest of the war. He fought on Guam in 1944, where his experience with machine gun employment again proved decisive in stopping Japanese counterattacks. After the war, he remained in the Marine Corps, retiring as a colonel in 1962. He spent his retirement years speaking to veteran groups and visiting military bases, always emphasizing the importance of training, leadership, and equipment reliability. In his speeches, Paige frequently mentioned the M1917. He called it the finest machine gun ever made for defensive warfare. He described how it had fired for hours without failure, how it had never jammed despite coral dust and humidity and continuous use, how it had kept shooting when everything else around him was chaos and darkness and death. The weapon that military theorists had dismissed as obsolete, that mobile warfare doctrine had suggested was a pole, a relic of trench warfare, had saved his life and the lives of every Marine on that ridge. The broader lesson, Paige argued, was about the danger of assuming that new automatically meant better. The M1919 was lighter, more mobile, and easier to operate than the M1917. By every metric that peacetime planners valued, it was superior, but it could not sustain fire the way the water-cooled gun could, and in combat, sustained fire was sometimes the only thing that mattered. Doctrine that emphasized mobility was correct for offensive operations, but defensive warfare demanded different capabilities. The mistake was assuming that one tactical approach fit all situations. The M1917 remained in American service long after World War II. It saw combat in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where its sustained fire capability again proved valuable in defensive positions facing Chinese human wave attacks. It was used by South Vietnamese forces during the early years of American involvement in Vietnam. The weapon was not declared obsolete and removed from inventory until 1968, exactly 50 years after it entered service. Few weapons in military history have had such extended service lives. The final M1917 guns were transferred to reserve units and training facilities, where they continued to teach new generations of machine gunners the principles of sustained fire and defensive employment. Some were donated to museums, where they remain on display as examples of effective military engineering. A few are still in private collections, carefully maintained by collectors who recognize their historical significance. The Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, which had been the Empire's equivalent to the M1917, also used water cooling and was capable of sustained fire. But Japanese forces had too few of them, insufficient ammunition to employ them effectively, and a tactical doctrine that emphasized attack over defense. When Japanese forces did use machine guns defensively in later Pacific campaigns, they achieved results similar to what American forces had experienced. Sustained fire stopped attacking infantry, but by then Japan was defending while Americans attacked, and Japanese ammunition shortages meant that sustained fire was often impossible to maintain. The story of the M1917 on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about the intersection of doctrine, technology, and industrial capacity. The weapon worked because it was well designed, but it was available because America's industrial base could produce it in quantity, and it was employed effectively because Marine doctrine valued sustained fire capability for defensive operations. Remove any one of those factors, and the outcome changes. Japanese forces attacked with courage and determination that matched anything in military history. Their soldiers advanced into machine gun fire knowing they would likely die. Their officers led from the front, dying alongside their men. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive action and offensive spirit. But courage and doctrine could not overcome the material reality of sustained defensive fire supported by unlimited ammunition, delivered by an industrial base that could outproduce its opponent by factors of 10 or 20 to 1. The Marines who fired those guns through the night of October 26th and into the morning of October 27th learned a lesson that would serve them through the rest of the Pacific War. When the enemy came in waves, you kept shooting until he stopped coming. The gun would hold if you kept it fed and watered. The ammunition would keep arriving because the factories back home never stopped producing. Your job was not to be clever or heroic. Your job was to maintain fire discipline, conserve your water supply, and keep shooting until the attack broke. They called it obsolete before the war started. They said it was too heavy, too complex, too tied to outdated doctrine. They were wrong. The M1917 water-cooled Browning machine gun was exactly what was needed when Japanese doctrine forced them to attack prepared positions with massed infantry. It was the right weapon for that specific kind of fight, and that fight happened over and over across the Pacific. Every time it did, the old Great War machine gun proved that sustained fire mattered more than mobility, that water cooling mattered more than weight savings, that reliability mattered more than modern engineering. The weapon that everyone said was worthless stopped every Banzai charge it faced. Not in 90 seconds, as the hyperbole suggests, but in sustained fire that lasted minutes or hours until the attack broke from sheer casualties. It did this not through any miracle, but through simple mechanical reliability and the capacity to keep firing when everything else would have failed. Sometimes, the old ways work because they were developed to solve problems that do not actually change despite new technologies and new doctrines. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.